Hello everyone, welcome to Nightmare Chronicles. If you're enjoying the story, drop a like and hit subscribe button. Your support really motivates me to create more videos like this. It was a cold winter night when I first encountered the skinwalker. My family had just moved to a remote cabin in northern Arizona, desperate to escape the hustle and bustle of city life. The cabin was small, tucked into a valley surrounded by dense pine trees. The isolation was peaceful at first, but it didn't take long for me to feel a strange presence lurking in the woods. I had heard the stories from the locals, tales of a creature that could shift its shape, wear the skin of animals and even people, and feed on fear. But like most, I didn't believe in such things. That was until the night I found myself alone. My parents had gone to visit some neighbors, leaving me behind to look after the house. I'd been reading by the fireplace when I heard it, soft knocking at the door. At first, I thought it was the wind or perhaps an animal, but then it came again. 3 knocks in quick succession. My heart began to race. I stood up and moved toward the door, my thoughts racing. It was far too late for anyone to be out there. I cracked the door open just a few inches, peering out into the darkness. There was no one in sight, only the heavy, silent forest stretching beyond the porch. My breath caught in my throat, but I told myself it was nothing, just my nerves playing tricks on me. As I was about to close the door, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't knocking, but the unmistakable sound of my mother's voice calling my name from the woods. "Come here, honey. It's your mom." I froze, my hand still on the door handle. The voice was perfect, just like her. But there was something off about it, something unsettling in the way she said my name. I stepped outside, looking around, but there was nothing, just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. I called out for her, but there was no response. A shiver ran down my spine. I stepped a little further out, my feet crunching the snow beneath me. "Mom?" I called again, my voice trembling. There was no answer. Then I saw it, movement in the trees. A figure, cloaked in the shadows, standing still. My heart skipped a beat. It looked like a person, but its posture was wrong. The figure was unnaturally tall, its limbs twisted in a way that made my stomach churn. And then I heard the voice again, closer this time. It wasn't my mother's voice at all. It was something deep, guttural, distorted, and the words it spoke sent a chill through me. "You shouldn't have come." My blood ran cold as the figure slowly stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like something not quite human. My body screamed to run, but my feet were frozen to the ground. The figure's face was shrouded in shadow, but I could see its eyes, dark, hollow pits filled with malice. It stepped closer, and the smell of decay hit me, nauseating and foul. I could feel the creature's presence pressing down on me, suffocating me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. It was as if the air itself had been stolen from me. And then it spoke again, but this time, its voice was different. It was my father's. "Come closer, I won't hurt you." I snapped out of my trance, my heart pounding in my chest, and I ran. I bolted back toward the cabin, not daring to look back. My mind was screaming at me to get inside, to lock the door, but I could still hear it behind me, its footsteps too fast, too close. The wind howled around me as I reached the door, fumbling for the handle with shaking hands. I slammed the door shut and bolted it, gasping for breath. But the terror didn't end there. For hours, I sat in the dark, heart racing, listening to the sounds outside. The wind had stopped, and all that remained was silence. But it was an oppressive silence, thick and heavy, like the world was holding its breath. I eventually fell into a restless sleep, waking to the sound of scratching at the door. I held my breath, hoping it was just my imagination, but the scratching continued, steady and deliberate. It wasn't an animal, it was something else. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp, and stood in the corner, waiting for the inevitable. Then I heard a low, rasping growl from the other side of the door. It was the most primal sound I've ever heard, something not meant for human ears. I held the lamp tightly, my fingers numb from fear. The growl turned into a laugh, a twisted, hollow sound that chilled me to my core. The skinwalker was out there, and it was getting closer. I could hear it moving around the cabin, its footsteps soft but deliberate. I knew it was waiting for me to make a move, to make a mistake. I didn't sleep that night, my eyes glued to the door, waiting for the sound of that twisted laughter to return. But as the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the cabin, the sound stopped. I cautiously opened the door, but there was no sign of the creature. No footprints in the snow, no trace of its presence, just the cold, empty forest. But I knew it hadn't left. It was still out there, somewhere, watching. And no matter how far I ran, no matter how many locks I placed on the door, it would always find me. The skinwalker had marked me, and I could never escape its reach. It was just a normal weekend when I decided to visit my cousin's ranch in the northern part of Arizona. I hadn't seen her in years, and it felt like the perfect time to reconnect, get some fresh air, and escape the chaos of the city. The drive was long, and the further I went, the more the landscape seemed to change, becoming desolate and eerie. The air grew thinner, colder, and the sky, no longer a bright blue, seemed a dull, ominous gray. By the time I arrived, dusk was settling over the land, casting long shadows across the empty stretch of land. The ranch was isolated, surrounded by dense forests and rocky terrain, with no neighbors for miles. When I pulled up to the house, I noticed my cousin Jessica standing on the porch, waving me over. Her smile was warm, but there was something off about her, a nervous energy in her eyes that I couldn't quite place. After exchanging pleasantries, she led me inside, and we spent the evening catching up. The house had an old, rustic feel to it, as though it hadn't changed in decades. The creaking floors, the musty smell of wood, and the sound of wind howling outside made the place feel more like a haunted relic than a home. As the night grew darker, Jessica mentioned casually, "You should be careful around here at night. There's something out there, something that roams the forests." I laughed it off, thinking she was joking, but she quickly added, "No, I'm serious. You're in skinwalker territory now." I raised an eyebrow, unsure if she was just messing with me. I'd heard of skinwalkers, shape-shifting witches that could take the form of animals or people, but I thought they were just stories, myths passed down through generations. Jessica didn't seem to be joking, though. Her expression was serious, her voice low, as though she were warning me about something dangerous. "You don't want to be out after dark," she continued, "especially near the woods." Later that night, after dinner, we were sitting on the porch talking when a strange noise broke the silence. It sounded like a woman crying, distant and mournful. The wind had died down, and there was no other sound in the air except for that eerie wail. I looked over at Jessica, who seemed visibly shaken. "It started," she whispered. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "The skinwalker. It feeds off fear. If you hear crying or calls in the night, don't go out. Whatever you do, don't follow it." Her warning hung heavy in the air. I didn't fully understand, but I nodded, trying to push the unease out of my mind. That night, I went to bed early, too tired to think about what Jessica had said. But sleep didn't come easy. I kept hearing those cries, distant yet close, as though they were right outside my window. My heart raced, and I lay frozen, waiting for morning. The next day, Jessica had to leave for a few hours, and I was left alone at the ranch. The silence was deafening. I decided to take a walk around the property, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. As I walked along the edge of the forest, I felt a strange sensation, like someone or something was watching me. The feeling sent a chill down my spine. Suddenly, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, as though someone was following at a distance. I stopped, turned around, but saw nothing. My breath caught in my throat. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no answer, just the rustle of leaves in the breeze. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, but then I heard the voice. It was faint, barely audible, but it was unmistakable. "Jessica, help me, please, I'm lost," the voice cried. I froze, my heart pounding. But something was wrong. The voice wasn't coming from the direction I'd heard it before. It was behind me, coming from deeper in the woods. My feet moved before I could think. "Jessica?" I shouted, my voice strained with panic. As I pushed forward into the trees, the voice continued, getting louder, more desperate. "I'm scared. Please, come find me." But as I ventured further, I noticed something odd. The sound wasn't quite right. The voice, while it sounded like Jessica, also had an unnatural edge to it, a rasping quality that sent a surge of terror through me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my instincts screamed at me to turn back. But I couldn't. I had to find her. I pushed deeper into the woods, the air growing colder with each step. The cries became frantic, like someone in real distress. And then in the distance I saw her, Jessica, standing just beyond the tree line. She was facing away from me, her back turned, her body unnaturally still. "Jessica?" I called, my voice hoarse. She didn't respond. I took a few cautious steps forward, but then something stopped me. Her reflection in a nearby puddle. Her face was twisted, her eyes black and hollow, her skin stretched and contorted into something grotesque. It was not her, not really. My blood ran cold and I spun around, desperate to run, but the forest had changed. The trees were closer, the path was gone, and the air felt thick, oppressive. The cries stopped. Everything was silent, but I could feel it. The presence, something lurking just out of sight. As I turned to leave, I saw it, the creature, emerging from the shadows. It stood on two legs, but its limbs were unnaturally long, the fingers tipped with sharp claws. Its face was a nightmare, a grotesque combination of human and animal features, with hollow eyes and a mouth that split open too wide to be natural. It grinned, showing teeth that were far too large, far too sharp. "You shouldn't have come," it rasped, its voice low and guttural. I didn't hesitate. I ran. I ran faster than I thought possible, my feet pounding against the earth as I pushed through the underbrush. The creature was behind me, gaining on me with every step. I couldn't look back, couldn't slow down. When I finally reached the edge of the forest, I collapsed, gasping for breath, my mind racing. The creature was gone, but I knew it was still out there. It was always watching. When Jessica returned later that day, I told her what had happened. She said nothing at first, just stared at me with a look of understanding and something darker, something more fearful. "You saw it, didn't you?" she asked, her voice trembling. I nodded. "It doesn't matter where you go," she continued. "Once it knows you, it never lets you go." I had always thought of myself as a logical person, someone who believed in science over superstition. But that belief was shattered one cold November night when I went camping in the remote wilderness of northern Arizona. My friends and I had decided to go off the beaten path, away from the usual campgrounds, seeking a more rugged experience. We'd rented an old beat-up truck and piled our gear into the back, excited for a few days of peace and escape from our busy lives. We set up camp near a quiet stream, the stars above us twinkling like diamonds in the night sky. Everything seemed perfect, peaceful even, until the wind started to pick up. It began softly, almost like a whisper, but soon it was howling through the trees, bending the branches in unnatural directions. We huddled around the fire, trying to keep warm as the cold bit into our skin. That's when I first heard it. At first, it was so faint, I thought it was just the wind, distant footsteps crunching on the dry leaves. But they were too rhythmic, too deliberate to be just the wind. I brushed it off as some wild animal, maybe a deer or a bear. But the sound grew louder, closer. I turned to my friend Mark, who was sitting next to me. He heard it too. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, his eyes darting to the darkness beyond the campfire. It wasn't just the sound of footsteps anymore. There was something else, something eerie about the way the steps echoed through the trees. And then came the voice. It was faint at first, a soft whisper that seemed to come from all around us, like the wind was carrying it. "Help me. I'm lost." The voice sounded like a woman, desperate and full of fear. I stood up, scanning the darkened forest. There was no sign of anyone, no movement beyond the flickering light of our campfire. The voice repeated itself, closer now, but it sounded wrong. Distorted, as though the speaker wasn't quite human. "Help me. Please." This time, the voice was accompanied by a rustling sound, as if something was moving in the bushes just out of view. My heart raced. Something wasn't right. "Stay here," I said to Mark, grabbing a flashlight and a hunting knife from our gear. I made my way toward the source of the sound, my steps hesitant but determined. The air felt thicker the farther I ventured from the camp, the trees looming above me like giants in the dark. I called out into the darkness, "Hello? Who's there?" My voice seemed swallowed by the night, and for a moment there was nothing but the sound of the wind. But then I heard it again. The voice, closer this time. "Please, help me." I turned quickly, and that's when I saw it, a figure standing just at the edge of the trees, partially obscured by the shadows. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, lanky arms hanging by its sides. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its face was wrong. The features were distorted, like a mask that had been stretched and warped. The creature took a step forward, and the moonlight revealed its eyes, empty black sockets that seemed to stare right through me. I froze, the air in my lungs suddenly thick and heavy. The creature's mouth opened and the voice came again, this time unmistakably not human. "Help me," it said, but it wasn't a plea anymore. It was a command, an invitation. I stumbled backward, my feet tangled in the underbrush as I tried to retreat. But the creature was faster. It moved silently, gliding toward me with unnatural grace, its limbs stretching unnaturally long, as though its body was bending in ways that were not possible. My mind raced, the logical part of me trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but all I could feel was the overwhelming sense of dread, of primal fear. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest, but I could hear it following me, those footsteps, so quiet, so deliberate, closing in. I burst back into the camp, gasping for air, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of the thing. "Mark! We need to go!" I yelled, but my voice came out in a frantic rasp. He was already standing by the fire, his face pale and wide-eyed, staring into the darkness. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. We didn't need to ask any more questions. We packed up everything in a rush, my hands shaking as I tried to fasten the gear to the truck. But before we could leave, I heard it again. Closer this time, unmistakable. "Come closer." The voice called from the woods, a twisted, mocking sound now. We jumped into the truck and sped off, the tires kicking up dust as we raced down the narrow trail. But the voice lingered in my mind. The image of that creature burned into my memory. It wasn't until we reached the nearest town that we dared to stop. I pulled into a gas station, hands still trembling. We looked at each other in silence, too terrified to speak. The old man behind the counter watched us, his expression unreadable. "You boys run into something out there?" he asked, as if he already knew. We nodded, too frightened to explain. He nodded knowingly. "Skinwalker," he muttered, as though the word itself held a weight that no one could escape. "You're lucky to be alive. Stay away from those woods. You don't mess with things like that." I never went back into those woods, and neither did Mark. The memory of that night stayed with me, haunting me for years. And though I tried to forget, every now and then, when the wind is just right, I hear it again. The voice calling from the darkness, beckoning me to come closer. And I know, deep down, that I'll never be truly free from that night. I had never believed in the supernatural, at least not until the night I encountered something I couldn't explain. Growing up in a small town on the outskirts of Arizona, I was accustomed to the dry, desolate desert that stretched out in all directions. I always figured the stories about skinwalkers were just myths, ghost stories passed down by elders to frighten children. That is, until I became part of a story myself. It started a few months ago when I took a job as a park ranger, a position I thought would be perfect for someone who loved the outdoors like I did. Most of my days were spent monitoring the trails, making sure hikers and campers were safe. But during the night shift, things began to take a strange turn. One evening, I was walking along the back trail, a path that veers into a dense area of the desert known to locals as the Dark Hollow. It's a spot most avoid, mostly because of the strange occurrences that have happened over the years. They say you hear things out there, voices, whispers, footsteps that aren't your own, but I never thought much of it. As I made my way along the trail that night, I began to hear what sounded like footsteps behind me, crunching softly on the gravel. I turned, expecting to see a lost hiker, but there was no one there. Only the wind and the shadows cast by the moonlight. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a coyote or a bobcat. But the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, wouldn't leave me. I continued my patrol, but the footsteps kept pace, growing closer with each step. The air felt heavy, as though the entire desert had gone still, holding its breath. I stopped, listening, and that's when I heard it. A whisper, barely audible, like a voice calling my name. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "John, come closer." It wasn't a voice I recognized, but it had an eerie, familiar quality, as if it knew me, as if it knew my deepest fears. I tried to move, but my legs felt like they were glued to the earth, unwilling to obey. And then, in the distance, I saw a figure standing in the shadows. A man. At least it looked like a man. He was tall, with long, ragged hair and a dark silhouette against the pale moon. But something about him wasn't right. His arms were unnaturally long, stretching down to the ground, and his body swayed in an unsettling way, as if he were somehow out of place in the world. I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to run, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. "Help me!" it called, the voice now sounding like a desperate cry. "I need help." My mind raced. This was it. This was what the locals had warned me about. The skinwalker. I had heard the stories, but I never thought I'd actually encounter one. They're creatures that can mimic the form of humans, usually those they've killed, and are known to lure people in with familiar voices, preying on their vulnerability. But why was it here, and why was it calling to me? My legs finally obeyed, and I began to back away slowly, never taking my eyes off the figure. But as I moved, it did too. The way it moved was unnatural, its body jerking and twitching like something wasn't quite right inside it. "Don't leave," it pleaded, but the voice now sounded distorted, twisted, as if the very words were being forced out. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned to run, but when I glanced back over my shoulder, I saw it wasn't just standing anymore. It was sprinting towards me, faster than any man could run. Panic surged through me as I broke into a sprint, the creature's footsteps echoing behind me, growing louder with each passing second. The wind whipped past me, and I could feel the temperature drop, a biting cold that seemed to freeze the very air around me. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear the thing getting closer, its breath ragged and heavy like something not quite human. As I neared the edge of the trail, I saw the lights of the ranger station in the distance. But it was too far away. The creature was almost upon me. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning with exhaustion, but I could hear it gaining ground. And then, just as I thought I couldn't go any further, the creature lunged, its long arms stretching toward me, claws clicking in the night air. I stumbled, falling to the ground, my face scraping against the dirt. But in that moment, the creature hesitated. It stopped, standing just out of reach. The air was thick with an overwhelming sense of dread, and for a moment, I thought it was going to drag me into the darkness, just like the stories said. But instead, it just stood there, watching me, with those hollow, dead eyes. I could feel its gaze burning into me, its presence suffocating. And then, without warning, it turned and vanished into the night, leaving me trembling on the ground, gasping for breath. I didn't go back to the dark hollow that night. In fact, I didn't go back to work for several days. I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still out there, waiting. I've never been able to explain what happened that night, and to this day, I can't bring myself to go back to that trail. But I know one thing for sure. What I saw wasn't human. It was something far worse, something ancient, and it knows my name. It happened on a weekend trip I took with a few friends to the Arizona desert, a place that was as beautiful as it was eerie. We were looking for a secluded spot to camp, far away from the usual tourist spots. After hours of driving down dirt roads, we found a spot by a dried-up creek bed that seemed perfect. There was a strange stillness in the air, but none of us thought much of it. It wasn't until nightfall that things started to feel off. Around the campfire, we laughed, joked, and told stories. But as the wind picked up, so did the tension. It was subtle at first, just a rustle in the brush, a feeling of being watched. I chalked it up to the usual desert wildlife, but soon I realized it wasn't wildlife. We all grew quiet as we heard it. A low, guttural growl, too deep to be from any animal we knew. My friend Mark laughed nervously, trying to brush it off as some kind of desert wolf, but the growl was too deliberate, too menacing. And then, we heard something else. It was a voice calling from the darkness beyond the campfire's reach, a woman's voice, soft and pleading. "Help me," she cried. At first we thought it was one of us playing a prank. But then the voice sounded again, this time closer. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "Help me." It was coming from behind a nearby hill, a place we hadn't ventured toward. We decided to investigate, not wanting to leave someone out there in trouble. As we made our way toward the sound, my skin began to crawl. The air was colder now, unnaturally cold, and the desert, usually so alive with insects and small animals, was eerily silent. When we reached the hill, the voice stopped, and there was nothing but the wind. We called out, but no one answered. It was then that we noticed something strange, fresh footprints in the dirt, leading further into the desert. They were human-shaped, but something was off. The footprints were too deep, as though whoever had made them was far too heavy, far too strong. We hesitated, but curiosity got the better of us, and we followed them. After about half a mile, we came upon a small clearing. The air smelled of something rotten, and the temperature dropped even more. Then we saw it. A figure standing in the center of the clearing, just beyond the moonlight, tall and gaunt. The way it stood, rigid, unnatural, sent a jolt of terror through me. It was human, but it wasn't. It had the twisted silhouette of something that shouldn't exist. The face was too pale, too smooth, and there were no visible eyes, just two black voids where its face should have been. It didn't speak, but I felt it. The creature was trying to make us feel fear. That's when I realized. The voice we'd been hearing, the woman's voice, it wasn't real. It was a trap. The figure began to move, its limbs bending at unnatural angles, crawling towards us with a speed that should have been impossible. We turned and ran, but the ground beneath us seemed to shift, the air closing in. I looked back once and saw the creature chasing us, its legs bent backward in a grotesque imitation of a human's, the black voids of its face staring directly at me. We barely made it back to camp, breathless, but we could hear it still. It was standing just beyond the light of the fire, waiting. And the worst part was, it wasn't the same creature anymore. As I stared at the campfire, the figure shifted. It became human again. The face changed into something familiar, something I knew, something I loved. It was my mother's face, but the eyes, they weren't her eyes. They were the same black voids I had seen earlier. "Come closer," it whispered, its voice now smooth, luring, like nothing I'd ever heard. But I knew better. I wasn't stupid. I backed away slowly, grabbing my friends, urging them to pack up. We couldn't leave fast enough. The creature stayed behind, in the dark, waiting for us to make one mistake. As we piled into the car and sped off into the night, I couldn't help but think about those eyes. They were still watching me, even now, and I knew it wasn't over. The skinwalker hadn't finished with us.